Hi there, everyone. I'm not sure what time of day you're listening to this, but for us, it's good afternoon. Welcome to this family talk, which is organised by Care Visions. And the aim of these family talks are for any parent or grandparent, carer, anyone who's involved with young people, for us to think about some of the important issues that our young people are dealing with in the world today and how we and they themselves can think about wise decisions to make, as well as how can we as parents and other people involved with them, how can we support them and help them navigate their way through some of these what can for many people be difficult issues. Today I'm delighted we've got Gael Cochrane with us, and she's going to say a bit about herself. We're particularly going to be thinking about the research she's been involved in the report the Many Good Men project. But and that was set up, as Gail will tell us, to think about how young people perceive online misogyny. But we want to be thinking particularly in this session today about pornography, about how young people are involved with pornography and what that means for them and how we protect them from ill effects of that. So, Gail, thank you for joining us. And do you want to just say a bit about yourself and who you are and where you work, etc.?
Yeah, thanks, Linda. I'm Gael Cochrane. My current role is as a learning, development and innovation lead at Community Justice Scotland, where we are primarily responsible for the sort of training and CPD of justice social workers and those working in the justice workforce. And as part of that, I'm involved with sexual offending, risk assessments, introducing justice workers to concepts around about sexual harm, sexual offending, and also domestic abuse, which is slightly more relevant to what we're talking about today. Prior to working at Community Justice Scotland, where I've been for nearly 8 years, I worked as a prison visitor centre manager, and before that, I worked with young people for many years in risk-taking behaviours. So initially, drugs, alcohol, prevention, education work, as well as direct work with young people, and working with professionals and parents about how to talk to young people about those issues. And then after that, I worked in sexual health and relationship education, and then the two kind of all merged into drugs, alcohol, sexual health, and everything, any kind of risks that young people might take. And when I was involved with sexual health and relationship education, I did educational work in schools and in the community, and I also worked in a sexual health clinic as well. So it was kind of clinical. I was a youth worker, but in a clinical setting as well.
Great. So you've some fantastic experience to bring to this. Um, can you tell us just a bit at the start about the Many Good Men project, what it was doing and how it was set up, just briefly so that people know the context of what we're going to be talking about?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Many Good Men project was initially an idea created by Claire Duffy from Civic Digits. Civic Digits is a creative project using drama and art that works primarily with young people in a kind of interactive way to help them deal with the world, I suppose, with the internet and with various different topics. So Claire Duffy had read a book called Men Who Hate Women by Laura Bates. And Laura Bates was the person that was responsible for the Everyday Sexism campaign, which people may have heard of. So Laura had been doing a similar job to me, actually, working in schools, doing sort of sexual health and relationship education, and she'd noticed that the language that the young people, particularly the young men, the young boys, were using towards women and girls and about women and girls had changed significantly, and she was trying to get to the bottom of that, and that's why she wrote the book Men Who Hate Women, which started to explore the incels and the manosphere, which I'll talk about a wee bit more in depth later. So Claire was really intrigued by this and decided to do a similar thing to Laura. What she did was she did a little bit of an experiment and just put in how to get a girlfriend online. And Laura Bates's research, she'd started off with what is feminism? That was her premise. She'd put in the search engine, what is feminism? And within a very few clicks had been led into very anti-feminist kind of narratives. Um, so Claire went for how do I get a girlfriend? Because she thought that might be something that, boys were more likely to be putting into a search engine. And again, within a very short time, she was directed towards the manosphere and algorithms and a lot of information that was really anti-women and girls. So she thought, well, let's do something about that. And she created a sort of participatory research project with two groups of young people, starting with that premise of how do I get a girlfriend? Um, and we created online anonymous profiles for them to allow them to delve into the manosphere. And we worked with two separate groups, girls and boys, on this to develop characters. We used drama, so I was really there for the education side of things, and Claire was responsible for the sort of drama side of the project. And yeah, we worked with them to develop a script that was acted out by professional characters. But really, it started off with the Men Who Hate Women book and the idea that young people, particularly boys, could get drawn in to an online world um, where there are very, very negative views about girls and women.
So tell us a bit more about that, because that's the bit I suppose that we find so distressing, that young men get drawn into this very misogynist, anti-women culture very easily, and or can at quite a young age. So tell us a bit more about that.
Yeah, so I think there's a few things going on. So I think all young people are exposed to a lot of information, a lot of images and things that they would never have been in the past as a result of technology and in particular smartphones, because they have access. They have access to the internet very, very easily. So I think that's again, it's anything looking for than getting information very, very quickly. I think the young people, the boys and young men can get drawn into the sort of so the manospheres, I suppose, lots of different things. So pickup artists, and then you've got your influencers like Andrew Tate and others who kind of promote a what they see as a sort of reclaiming of manhood and masculinity, often couched in um sort of about health or, health and fitness. And then further on, than that is a sort of more the incel side of things, which is very particularly um, negative about women, thinks, view women as a different class. There's talk of seeing the world, taking a red pill and seeing the world as it really is, where women are in charge of everything and men are subjugated. So there's lots to it. It's quite a complex kind of world, and they all kind of intersect. So what you might get is boys and young men kind of looking at Andrew Tate, for example, or thinking, "How do I get a girlfriend?" And then getting, hearing them talk and think, "Oh wow, this looks great. This guy's attractive and he's fit and he's giving me tips on how to look good and how to attract girls." But actually underlying that is a lot of really, really negative attitudes about women and girls and about their place in society there are some very, very extreme ideas. So it goes from maybe just we need to be more traditional. We need to be more traditional. Women and men need to know what their roles are, to women should really just be sex slaves. They're imagining a world where women and girls are only there to provide sex and children and look after men. So it's a real quite extreme range. And it's not difficult to get sucked into the more extreme end of things. I was going to say something else here, and it's completely gone.
And
I'll, yeah, sorry, you go.
no, I mean that's we have in some of these other family talks talked about the manosphere and just how excuse me, pernicious it is and draws young people into it. But I was particularly interested in your work that talked about how young people, particularly young men who are vulnerable to this ideology, get pulled into pornography and what that means, but also just in general, how many young people are being exposed to pornography. Um, I noticed one of your statistics said 10% of boys, I think this was, had viewed pornography by the age of 9,
Yeah.
which is much younger than I think most of us would have understood.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, that's the one. I think the one factor that often isn't talking about when we speak about the incel culture and the manosphere is that the really, really strong links to pornography. That actually a lot of the attitudes, the change in attitude towards girls and women have come about as as a result of boys and young men looking at images, seeing pornography from quite a young age. It goes hand in hand with with the manosphere and the change in attitudes. So from so I think so there's some young men who are more vulnerable, and they will be the ones who are more likely to get involved and maybe the more extreme end of things, and that may be more at risk. And I should have said violence is also part of that. So violence very much plays a part,
Yeah.
that other more extreme end of it. But I think as regarding pornography, it's very young age. So smartphones came into, popular usage with teenagers about 2015, with everybody about 2015. But really then people were 15 and 16 when they were getting smartphones.
Yeah.
And we saw in sexual health a real change in attitudes and language about the sexes in general at that time, as well as a change in views of sharing intimate images of each other as well. Which again, I don't think it is a fairly normal behaviour. It's just we have technology now that changes the nature of it, because you've got a concrete image, that can be shared. But there was definitely a sort of change in attitudes. So that was 10 years ago. And if we think about now, and then I remember there was I think there was it was about 5% of 10-year-olds had seen pornography, by about 2017, 2018. It's now gone up. It's younger, it's 9 years old, and it's more of them. So some will come across it by mistake. Some will be sent it by their friends. Often, some really don't want to see it, but I think the fact is they're exposed to it. Um, there was a recent piece of work done by a journalist, and she went up and down the UK speaking to children and young people about pornography. And she was talking to children who were very young. And one thing that really stuck in my mind was a little girl who was about 5, who was saying that when she was playing on her iPad, that things would pop up that she didn't like. So she'd just turn away and draw until she heard it stop, and then she would go back, and it was pornography. So it's young people are aware of it. They're aware it's not for them, that it's not for children, but they don't know what to do about it, particularly when they're that young. And then you've got the normalisation of it being sent for a laugh or amongst people from primary school age now, mostly in secondary. But it's become fairly normal. Children know what pornography is. Primary school children know what it is now. They probably wouldn't have known what it was before. And with that has come a change in behaviours that affect all young people, I think, or most young people. So yes, we've got the really extreme end. We've also got a rise in sexual offending amongst young people, sexual harassment, sexual offending. There's no doubt it's had an impact on behaviour. And I think that's the bit that can affect everybody, because sorry, I'll let you carry it.
No, no, it's fascinating what you're saying. I wasn't meaning to stop
Mhm.
you at all. I was just thinking that as the online companies have to get stronger proof of age,
Mm.
is that strong enough? How, young, we don't want children
Yeah.
that young at all looking at these sites. How do we prevent that?
I mean, I really hope that the bill changes things. I mean, that has been called for a very, very long time. I know that in sort of around 2015 and after, myself and others who were working in sexual health were like, we knew we didn't think children should have access to smartphones. And at that point, it was 15, and then a few years later, it was 12 it seemed to be the accepted age to get one, and now we're talking nursery school, primary school. So I think there's got to be a bit of parental rules, boundaries laid down by parents, and an understanding that it isn't an innocuous, harmless device that they have. Um, I think that parents have got a role to play, but but they can't do everything and they can't know everything. And I think the law, yeah, is very, very well overdue, and I think it will help. It absolutely will help. When pornography became free and it became accessible and there was no age restrictions, we saw a massive uptake in the use of it. you
Yeah.
know. So I think it will make a difference. I think it already has made a difference. I'm sure there was some stats out a couple of weeks ago about how viewing levels on Pornhub and other sites had dropped dramatically. So
And is porn changing? You talked about violence, and certainly in your report, it talked about the violence that people were seeing within sexual relationships. Is that getting worse, or is it just we weren't so exposed to it before?
I think that there will always have been pornography, from one extreme to the
Yeah.
other. I think the difference is the way it's used and how people view it. So in the past, you might have got a film, or a book or a magazine, and within them there would be a story, and it wasn't just a small clip of sex. There'd be other things going on round about it, and people would have to use their imaginations to a certain extent. There would be a build up to being aroused. It was different neurologically what was going on. Now people tend to consume pornography, particularly men, by downloading clips because they get access to all these sites with every different kind of pornography on it. So you don't have to seek out extreme porn anymore. You can get it. You just have to look for it. There's categories for every different kind of porn on these sites. Um, and what people will tend to do is download clips. So the best bits, if you like. So they'll have lots of 3-minute clips or 5-minute clips of the bits that they like that get them most aroused. So it's constant dopamine, hits. It's not a build up. It's not no imaginations being used. That the nature of that's changed, so it's constantly around try to keep yourself aroused for as long as possible. Um, and then there's also the fact that the access to the extreme stuff is very available. And we know from children and young people that they're interested in the extreme stuff because they want shock. The shock of it is just as much as everything else. The shock of seeing it does the same thing to the brain with the dopamine, with the adrenaline, as any sort of arousal. So for them, if it's shocking, if it's gory, if there's animals involved, if there's anything like that, then that makes them it kind of has a different kind of hit. So we know that that's one thing. Um, and also if they are looking at porn that's has young people in it, so has young women in it, or young men, but the stuff with young women tends to be more extreme. So again, another female journalist did a really good piece of work a few years ago, going on all the sites and looking at what all the different kinds of pornography and sort of looking at what the demographics of the people were in the films, and the most violent ones were the ones that tended to involve young women. So, the ones that
Mm.
involved strangulation, the ones that involved, a lot of violence tended to have younger women in them. So, yes, there was pornography that had older people that was much more consensual or had perceived to be much more consensual, but they didn't have as much violence, but that doesn't tend to be what young people are looking at.
And
Um
how is it affecting young people, do you think?
So I think there's a lot of things. I think there's the first thing that we saw, which was expectations of what girls and boys should look like. So I think that was one of the first things that we saw as educators or in the clinic was, people thinking girls had to look a certain way and boys had to look a certain way. So one of the first things we saw was hairlessness, people getting rid of all their body hair. That was one of the first things that we were kind of aware of. It's like you had to look smooth, you had to look, you know, um, girls don't have short hair. And sort of very stereotypical ideas of what girls and boys should be like. And if you fell out with that, then, what were you? So there was that. So that was the first thing that was obvious. And then the next thing I was aware of, so we're talking early days here, and we're talking now and how that's impacted the justice system, was that people were talking about, girls were talking about being coerced into having anal sex. Um, and when we were working in classrooms, boys and girls were talking about anal sex as a normal as a practice just alongside, any other kind of intercourse. It wasn't perceived to be something that in the past they'd always perceived it as something only men did together. And then, and we used to always talk to them about that, but they would be, "Oh no, it's for everybody. It doesn't make any difference. It doesn't make any difference." So, and things like some of the sexual practices that they were seeing in pornography were talked about as just, they're the sort of things that they wanted to try, or they had tried. But the biggest changes were the strangulation during sex and the anal sex, I would say. They were the things that really struck us as high risk activities that young people were starting to engage in. And even then, I mean, I say that probably about 8 years ago, a bit of research came out about that. And it still wasn't everybody, it still wasn't completely normalized, but there were certainly higher levels. There was talk of young girls feeling, boys, in the past, if we think about back to a film like Grease, where they're trying to they're trying to have sex, and it's this big, their aim, that's what they want, that's their aim. They're going to coerce the girls into doing it. They're going to pester them. They're going to, try and force them. It was that same kind of mentality, except it was for anal sex. So vaginal sex was just expected. We're going to, that's going to happen, but we've got to try and got to try and go a little bit further. And then we also have magazines like Teen Vogue, aimed at 13 to 18-year-olds over the past, well, it's quite a while ago now actually, but they had an article about anal sex. They had an article about strangulation, and presented it as, not risky. These are things that are, normal sexual practices. So it's not just happening in the porn world, it's also happening in more mainstream media as well. So I think the risks of that, and so, and alongside that, more sort of domestic abuse amongst young people. So people doing things they didn't necessarily want to do, and also more violence within that as well. And
I
increased.
Sorry to interrupt. I was just noticing that term in your report, kink shaming, which I hadn't heard before. That, if you want to slap someone during sex and that's what you like doing, you shouldn't feel ashamed of that. And yet the girls were saying it's not kink shaming. It's saying that's not a good thing to do or whatever. Tell us more about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that was actually one of my not favorite, but that was one of for me, when we were doing the work with the girls, when we were sort of analysing things. The fact that they said that, I thought was really powerful, and I was really pleased that it made it into the report, because the pornography has become so mainstream. It has become so mainstream, particularly with younger people, and things like BDSM, so bondage, sadomasochism, which is something that would have been regarded as something you did in private, consenting adults. It wasn't something that you talked about with your pals. It was if you were going to do it. But I think, well, I should also say 50 Shades of Grey did change things a bit as well, the book, because that was the first, like, before the smartphones, 50 Shades of Grey came out, and we noticed young people talking about things like nipple clamps and talking about bondage and talking about sadomasochistic practices they'd never mentioned before. But they were already in 50 Shades of Grey when they were in fourth year and fifth year. But that book did, I think it did change the narrative a little bit about what was acceptable to, what was acceptable. But I think, yeah, so kink in all its forms, be that dressing up in a particular way, or bondage and sadomasochism, or furries, which is another thing, that's sort of all these things that kind of became normalized to show people that what your fetish was or what your kink was in certain groups. And if somebody said they were uncomfortable with it, they'd say you're kink shaming them. And that's a really I've heard it so many times, even amongst professionals whilst doing sexual offending training. You know, that real blurry line between what's socially acceptable and what's not socially acceptable, and what you should tell people about yourself, and what is harmful and what isn't. There's a real blurry line for some people. So for the girls in particular, that we worked with, they were always they talked about boys in their class looking at porn on their phones when they were in class sitting next to them, spoke about the links between really violent porn that they were watching, and also gore, really quite violent, and about how that was desensitizing some of the boys to the harm that these things could cause. But again, if they pulled them up on it, if they said, "Oh," they would be told they were kink shaming, or. So I think for me, I was really pleased that they recognised that, yeah, you should be allowed to say public to say to somebody that, that is coercive, or that is violent, or that is, that isn't an acceptable thing to do to somebody, when some things should be private. If two people do consent to do something, that's fine, but that should be private. Um, so that's kind of where it came from. But as I say, I was really pleased that they came to that conclusion themselves.
Yes.
Because one of the girls in the group initially, she'd unfortunately, and again back to her stats, she had viewed porn at 9, pornography at 9. Um, Luckily, she spoke to her parents about it. She didn't keep it to herself, which again, really, I suppose that's the key thing. Encouraging that sort of communication. So she told her parents, but she was very much from the sitting on the fence about how she felt about pornography. Whereas the other girls were very anti it from the start, from the get go. She wasn't sure. I think she was kind of, well, everybody does it, everybody watches it, it's normal, that's just what you do. So her attitude, it came a bit of full circle at the end of the project as well. But so I suppose for safety, I suppose communication is absolutely always going to be up there with any of these things. Being able to talk about it and not be embarrassed. And I know that's difficult. I know that's really, really difficult for parents and carers. But the difference between the young people that tend to have problems. So to give the example of looking at pornography at a really young age, not knowing really what it's about, being a bit shocked, having all those emotions and all those feelings about it. The young person that talks to a family member about it and gets the context and protections are put in place, to the young person that watches it and has all those feelings but has nowhere to go with them, you know, that can have a massive impact. And that actually, in both the characters that were created in the project by the girls and the boys, that was a feature that the person who went on to become the incel, so one character didn't and one character did in both plays, had seen pornography at a very young age but didn't talk to anybody about it. There were other things as well, lots of other things, like living in a home where there was domestic abuse, being quite socially isolated, other kind of risk factors as well. But that was in there with all the sort of histories that we looked at.
And if a very young child, they are still children at 9 or even younger from one of your examples, sees pornography, is that because somebody sent it to them? Or how have they come across it if they have not been seeking it out?
I mean, could be because somebody sent it to them. It could be that they're being targeted. It could just be that there's no parental controls. We know that not very, very young children, but we know that, companies are target particular age groups for certain things like gambling and pornography. Young men are going to be the targets for that. And if I mean, and I know it's very easily done. My daughter, quite a long time ago, when she was 9, looked and put in something in a search engine, and I'm sure, can't remember what band she was into the time, but it was about them, and she ended up on a pornography site.
Right.
Um, and she told us, and it was fine, and but I think that's how easy it was. She just put the wrong thing. She put the wrong thing in a search engine. So it can be putting the wrong thing in a search engine. It can be targeted. YouTube is. I don't know if, I mean, if people take the time, if they're on YouTube, to look at the trending videos that are usually on the right hand side,
Yeah.
often they're really extreme. It was actually my nephew many years ago who said told me about it because all the cousins were together and they were looking at their favourite music videos, and he was like, "Oh, stuff on that, we'll need to keep an eye on what they're clicking on because there's some stuff in there that's not appropriate." So it's easy. It's so easy. Any kind of social media, if they have access to it, it's rife, even more so than the actual pornography sites. So Snapchat. Most young people aren't on Twitter, but Twitter has got loads and loads and loads of pornography on it. I get sent direct messages all the time, and often they're pornographic things. So it's pervasive.
Yes.
So,
We'll, we'll,
parental.
we'll, we'll come back to what parents or what more parents and others caring for young people can
Yeah.
do. But I wanted to ask you about another term in the report, demisexual.
Mhm.
But explain to me what that was about, because girls had talked about that and that they felt that was about having relationship. Well, you explain it. You'll be better
Yeah.
at it.
I mean, there's a lot of terminology now. There's a lot of terminology now to define lots of different types of relationships. And it was one of the it's just that demisexual, my understanding of is that it means a relationship where you get to know the person first and you like them as a person before you have a sexual relationship, which we had a conversation about in our group, particularly as myself and Claire were both middle-aged and the girls were all young, and about all that is in our lifetime, that would just be a normal relationship. That would be that would be what you'd expect, that you'd get to know someone, you'd like them, and then you'd maybe fancy them, and you'd maybe go on to have a sexual relationship. That bit, so you've got it's about having an emotional connection with somebody. I think now, because there's so much hookup culture as well with young people, the way people have relationships is very, very different. Not all of them. You still get some who, just start going out with somebody at school, but there's an awful lot of older young people choosing not to have relationships, or only meeting people on apps, going out and meeting them, sometimes meeting them for sex, sometimes not. But it's a very, very different way of building relationships with people now. So that's why I think those kind of terms have come into play, because there are some people who I think it's easier for them to say, I'm not interested because I'm this,
Right.
because
Yeah.
we've got a lot more young people identifying as being asexual now. And again, when we used to do sexual health training, so, about one less than 1% of the population would be, would be asexual, and they were often people who, not always, it was sometimes a medical issue, sometimes it was because of trauma. There was a variety of reasons why somebody would be asexual. And some people, but it was a very small percentage of society. And roll on 10 years, we've got really huge chunks of young people saying they're asexual. You know, um,
Mhm.
so again, I mean, there's lots of ideas around about what that some people say because they're aware of it now, but I do wonder if it's a wee bit of fear, um, a wee bit of fear of sex because of everything that's going on. It's so complicated, there's so much out there. There's quite scary images you know, and it's possibly a way of protecting themselves from that. That's just my supposition. I'm not entirely sure.
No, it's interesting, isn't it? And by asexual, they mean they've decided they're not going to have sex just now. They're not, or
Yeah,
is it
people who are interested
more
in
than
who don't have any sexual who
It's
believe they don't have any sexual feelings, they don't feel
right.
sexually attracted to anybody. Um, but some of the people are saying that are very as well, so I do wonder if they really understand what it means, if they are actually sexually mature, you know.
Yeah.
It's
Mhm.
certainly a trend. So yeah, so not being sexually attracted to anybody. Yeah.
And this early exposure to pornography, the kind of pornography young people are looking at and it being normalized, what effect is that having on their self-esteem and just their mental health in general?
I mean, I don't think, I think, I'd say the vast majority, hopefully, it won't have too much of an effect. But I think for a number of them, I think it's, a feeling of an inadequacy. Oftentimes, I think it is gendered to a certain extent. I think, I think for both sexes, I think the feeling of inadequacy because they don't look like the people that they're seeing. We know that, young people are very, very prone to to low self-esteem, particularly girls comparing themselves to others as it's a normal part of growing up. But there's so many images and so many things to compare yourself to, so I think it can have an impact on that. I think for boys, thinking that they've got to perform in a particular way, and actually when they are faced with a real person, you know, be that male or female, then they might things probably aren't going to go the way that they see,
Mm.
but they see in pornography. So that must again have an impact on them. I think for me, it's what I see, and again, this is only anecdotal because we've got wee bits and pieces of research, is that it's that fear of intimacy, because people are worried, a wee bit worried about what's gonna happen, if they're gonna be forced into something, if they're not gonna do what's expected of them. I think that as part of it, and that obviously it may make people avoid relationships. Um, we're certainly seeing a decline in sexual behaviour, with young people. And if we look back 20 years ago, that's what was happening in Japan. And Japan was at the forefront of all the sort of technology and all the pornography and all the different ways of like AI and all the different ways of sort of online sexual kind of behavior. Japan was kind of at the forefront, and their rates of children being born, but also rates of people having sex has been declining since then. So I don't think we're quite on exactly the same track, but there's definitely changes. You got people just choosing not to have relationships, or so that's got to have an impact on on people. But I think it's more pressure, isn't it? There's lots of pressure on young people, and it's more pressure. I've spoken to boys who are like sort of 15, 16-year-old boys about strangulation, and saying that, how risky it is, and that one of the boys said, "Oh, but my girlfriend asked me to do it." And you hear that a lot when you talk to boys and men about strangulation, and again, everybody thinks it's normal now. Everybody thinks it's something that you're supposed to do. Doesn't mean they necessarily enjoy it. It doesn't mean, but it's become so normalized that people are asking, "Oh, are we going to do this?" Which puts pressure. So it's about educating everybody to understand how risky it actually is. Because it makes me despair a little bit thinking about a scenario where neither party wants it to happen, but they think they
Yeah.
have, you know. Um,
It's so interesting because somebody like me who spent a lot of their career looking at teenage pregnancy rates, trying to see them reduce, and thankfully they did reduce. And we thought, "Oh, that's good. That's to do with our good sex education and good contraception." But actually, now it could have a whole lot of other reasons that are not as healthy. Um,
Yeah.
and that's concerning. And so let's think a bit about then what can parents do to support their young people through this difficult um, area. And
Mhm.
I know, speaking to my own children and thinking about my grandchildren, people always assume, "Oh, my child's not exposed to this."
Yeah.
They've got I know they've nothing to do with this, and yet from what you've been saying, more and more children are exposed to this, and even if they haven't sought it out, they're being exposed to it through their friends. So what can we do as parents and carers and grandparents?
Suppose, I mean, I always say the first thing is talk.
Yeah,
Be open and honest and talk about it. If something makes them feel uncomfortable, they see something that makes when they're if even if they're very wee, they see something that makes them uncomfortable, to encourage them to talk about it. But I suppose the layer to that is, parental controls, not accessing devices. I mean, that's the one thing that everybody can do that'll make a massive difference, is making sure they're really, really stringent parental controls on any devices. That they're not going to be able to access any adult content. I mean, I think that's the first thing that everybody can do. But the second thing is that if it does happen, and it could be because you might, some people, they see it on somebody else's phone, somebody shows it to them. It's just about open and honest kind of dialogue. I think that that is really, really key. Not being afraid to talk about it. And you're right, people don't think it happens to their children. I remember 10 years ago, my girls were 10 and 8, and I remember saying to friends who had older children, "Oh God, this is really worrying," and they were like, "Oh, I'll be fine." Because they didn't want to think that their children would be impacted by it, and I absolutely understand that.
yeah,
But we have to recognise this as part of their world, and we have to have honest and open conversations about it. And I think I remember there used to be a line that, when you talked about pornography with children, you'd say, "They're only acting," but actually I don't think that's helpful. When we talked about it with the girls and the boys in the groups, we talked about pornography as being sort of violence against women and about the health impacts, physiological and psychological health impacts on people who are involved in pornography, and, and about commodifying of bodies, be they male or female. So we spoke about it from quite a political perspective, which I think really helped as well, because it's not just people acting. There's a lot more to it. It's a big industry, So we spoke it in. A lot of young people are really interested in people making money out of people and exploiting people. So it's a good in. It's a good way to talk about it. Um, the things that we spoke about was like, particularly for boys and young men, is having outlets and support systems to talk about emotions and to talk about relationships in a healthy way. So I mean that applies to all to all young people, just allowing them to have a conversation. Um, I think the talk with them about online communication as well, and about the difference between the real world and that but it is a real world to them. So it is a real world, and I think that again, the language that we use makes a difference as well. About the differences between the online world and the physical world, and um, I think the ones that we should worry a wee bit more about are the ones who don't have as many people, face to face friends, and what we can do to kind of encourage that and to work on that to give them more opportunities. Being creative helps as well. I found that from being involved in this project, that using creative ways to think about it was great. The educational stuff was great and I loved it, but the using the drama exercises and the young people getting a chance to act out what it's like to be a boy if they're a girl and a girl if they're a boy, and their own sex as well, and the restrictions they have that they hadn't really thought about. Um, I think not shaming. So if a young person is, and I think that's key, because if we shame young people, then they're just going to internalize it, and there's a lot of negative connotations that. So I suppose it's about just trying to talk about it in a as non-judgmental way as possible. Um, and that can be difficult because people are fearful. Parents and carers are fearful, and sometimes we get things wrong, but that's okay as well. I think it's okay to get if you're starting a conversation, that's the most important thing. Starting a conversation going and having that. If you can have that open dialogue from when they're young, that's great because it makes it easier. If you started talking about when they're wee, they're still going to get embarrassed. They're still going to get
Yeah.
embarrassed, teenagers, but at least they expect it from you, you know. But don't. I suppose the key thing is don't expect somebody else to do it.
Yeah.
Don't expect somebody else to have the conversation with them, because schools probably aren't. And a lot of people don't want. Some people don't want schools to have that conversation with their children. Their peers are often going to be in the same boat. You know. So I think it's about trying to just be honest with them. If you don't know something, say you don't know it. Ask a question. Say, I've never heard that term before. What does that mean?
Yeah.
There's nothing wrong with not knowing. Yet it's so hard to keep up.
Yeah. I know awareness in parents, I think, is really important in this. That there's a lot we weren't exposed to as young people, and therefore we don't know about it. But to know that there's that whole world there that our young people are exposed to, even if, as you say, you don't know what all the terms mean or don't understand it all, to be able to then open a conversation about it because you know it's out there, I
Yeah,
think is really important. But
yeah.
often for parents, talking about sex with your children is not the easiest thing to do, is it? And we often need to be educated in how to do that well without being judgmental or saying, well, just don't do it. You know, young people will explore things. So, is there somewhere parents themselves can get help with this?
I'm thinking about resources that are available well, I used to work for NHS Lothian, and they used to have some really great wee booklets about how to talk to your children about sort of
Yeah.
sexual health and relationships. I'm just gonna I think if they look on Healthy Respect,
Yeah.
NHS Lothian, they
Yeah.
often used to have downloadable resources that were excellent, and I'm assuming that they still do. They did the last time I checked.
Yeah.
So your NHS is usually the best place to go. They usually have really age-specific resources about how to talk about things and how to put things simply. But I suppose the key thing is it's relationships as well. So it's about what makes a healthy relationship. Most of the sexual health and relationship education, apart from the clinical stuff that you're talking about, with preventing pregnancy and STIs, was actually about relationships and
Yes.
about what is a healthy relationship and encouraging young people, if they are in relationships, to talk to each other. And
Yes.
to be able to say that they're not happy with something, they know that this isn't something that they want to do. I think, that's the core of it. Still, the core of it is encouraging the young people themselves, the children, to talk, to potential boyfriends, girlfriends, to have open communication. Because ultimately, if you're communicating and you trust each other, and one of you says, "Actually, I don't want to do this. I don't like this," or if there's respect for each other, they're a lot less likely to engage in the more harmful kind of activities.
Yeah. And for girls especially to have the self-esteem to be able to say, I don't want to do that. I shouldn't feel pressurized into that. One
Yeah.
of the things that also you talked about and you alluded to at the start was about some of these issues and violence and how one can lead to the other. Uh, How do we, well, tell us more about that and how we might prevent that.
Yeah, so I suppose that, again, there's two aspects to that. Is if young men, boys get drawn in to so I mean, it's algorithm. So it's the way the internet works. They look at one thing and they get
Yeah.
targeted. Somebody, the designer's like, oh, that person's that demographic. I'm going to target them with all this information, and they do go down rabbit holes. So I suppose it's a bit of prevent. If that happens, how can we intervene? And I think it's the young people that are harder to do an intervention with, the ones who maybe are more anxious and have social anxiety, are the ones that's going to be more difficult to deal with. But again, it's a tiny, tiny minority of that are in that situation. But when you're in that world is a lot more violent. So there's one thing that links all the manosphere, all the different elements of it, and that violence is used to control women, and it's talked about. And some of the mass shooters from America are kind of idolized, and there's a lot of chat about going out and shooting or stabbing women and girls. So there's that element of it there that's definitely, when they go further down that kind of hole, then there's a lot more of talk of violence. If you're talking the manosphere, kind of Andrew Tate type things, he talks about sexual coercion. His course that he runs is very much about how to coerce and pimp girls and women. Which again, if you looked at, I've so documented when they were going through some of the elements of what they were teaching boys and men, and it was coercive control. They were trying to teach them how to be coercive controllers, and that's against the law. And
Yeah.
we know that coercive controllers often go on to commit violent acts as well. So there's that element there. It might not be as obvious, but there is that element there of women and girls need to be controlled. We're stronger, we're powerful, um, and at a more sort of physical day-to-day level, I think it's just the reenactment of what boys are seeing is leading to an increase in violence. So for the we're not talking about the small minority that are going into the really violent stuff online, but they're sort of the majority, the larger amount of young men who are maybe just exposed to quite a lot of violence, in pornography that they're watching or associated with gore, when they are engaging in relationships and that wanting to act out what they see, or thinking that hitting your partner is normal, or I won't go into some of the other extreme things, but really distasteful, horrible, degrading things that that becoming normalised. I think there's a bit about they're seeing things at a young age, so their brains are very elastic. Their dopamine, they're getting their dopamine hit, and it's changing the way their brain works. So they're expecting this kind of hit of dopamine, and it also numbs them to a certain extent to what they're doing. And I've heard that from many, from men who are now in their 20s, who were young, who were watching a lot of pornography when they're younger and things, they're kind of numbed. So they maybe are carrying out acts and they're not really feeling, they don't sense that their partner is experiencing pain or harm of any sort. And we ha- and I don't think they're necessarily conscious of that or aware of aware of what they're doing or the extent of what they're doing. I think ideas about consent are still very blurry. Even though we've been doing work on that for years, I still don't think people really know what it means. And so we are seeing a rise. We're seeing more young men committing sexual offences. The young people the people who are being seen in justice services are a lot younger now than they were 10 years ago. Um, so the average age of sort of first conviction for a sexual offence has dropped, quite significantly. And anecdotally from those working in forensic services as well, with people who commit sexual offences or harmful sexual behaviour, again, the age is younger. So there's definitely something happening there, and that's making an impact on behaviour. We're seeing a rise in domestic abuse with young people. I think we're now kind of capturing 16-year-olds in that information, which we never used to before. And there's some really quite shocking statistics from studies like the Girls Guide studies, and also crime and justice surveys, about young women's experiences of sort of domestic abuse, sexual harassment, um, and I don't think we can get away from the fact it's increasing. So that's a societal level. We're seeing that schools as well. So, a lot of sexual assaults happen within schools. Um, and I don't know how they're dealt with in that environment. I heard a really shocking thing yesterday at an event I was at from research done in the children's hearing system, and a girl having to still go to school with the boy who raped her, still in some of the same classes. So where we've got some real, really quite serious sexualized behaviour happening in schools as well, which I suppose isn't a huge surprise if it's been seen, not fully understood, boundaries aren't there, or an understanding the boundaries isn't there. Um, so yeah, it's having that's what worries me. I think the young men who go down the more extremist end of things and self, they're probably the sort of young men who would have maybe in the past joined another extremist.
Yes.
It's because they share the same attributes. There's lots and lots of attributes about these boys and young men that are very similar, and that hasn't really changed much over time, other than access to the internet and being able to get in groups easier because of the internet. But I think in a sort of more wider society level, we have seen a change in behaviour. Um,
Yeah. Just some questions from others, if you don't mind. Not the easiest questions, but you'll be able to answer them. So, if a young person has already gone deep into that misogynist manosphere, some of the worst parts of that, what does a realistic pathway look like to get them back onto something that's much more positive and constructive?
yeah, I mean, I think the kind of suppose it was the outcomes of what we saw from our report, is the providing alternatives, providing alternative outlets and support systems to help emotions be processed, because you see that really strongly. This is about really strong emotions, feelings of low self-worth, feelings that they're not good enough, and they're getting something from the manosphere,
Yeah.
that they're not getting elsewhere. So it's about trying to find a positive outlet for that. Um, you
What are
know,
some examples of that?
I mean, that's the that I suppose that's the the big question, isn't it? So
Yeah.
you've I mean, I think at the more extreme end is, um, well, talking. I mean, finding groups, finding activities, finding things that they can do that they maybe have an interest in. If it's got to be online, because it might be that's their, ga there are lots of online communities that aren't risky, that you can put safeguards in place where they can maybe have a more healthy outlet.
Yeah. Yeah.
I would also suggest given the books that I've read and some, the information is encouraging them to have relationships, friendships with girls and women.
Yeah.
I think because when they're in that hole, girls and women are painted as, we're the bad ones. It's our fault this is happening to men. Men have no status anymore because of women and because of feminism, and they really do view women and girls as other, and that's the problem. As soon as you start to other somebody, that's when you're more likely to be violent towards them. So I think positive relationships with females, particularly ones their own age, I think that is got to be part of it, as well as having opportunities to talk to boys in ways that aren't online, or it is online in a safer environment, maybe playing say gaming or, something
Yeah.
that's not in any way pornographic or in, sort of manosphere. Eh, but so I think
Uh,
for older men, you see things like the men's sheds as an opportunity for men to get together and talk, and, we d we don't have that for boys, but we do have sports clubs, but it might be and that's not so you've really got to go with what their interests are and find something. But I would definitely say try and encourage positive relationships with females.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
really good helpful advice. And if a parent sees their child sharing Tate-like style content, what should be their approach? This is wrong, this is terrible, or can we just talk about this? Or how do they approach that with their child?
And I would say talk to them about them. Talk to them about ask them what it is about somebody like that appeals. What is it that they're saying? What is about that that you like? Just have a really curious conversation with them and ask them what it is that's about it, and then maybe start to maybe set aside a certain time. We're gonna talk about this, but we're gonna talk about it for half an hour every day or something like that. And just kind of delve deeper into it and ask, find out what it is. Maybe encourage them to think about the other things that are being said. Then maybe think about alternatives, so that it's not always just, to encourage them to see that as just one side of things. And it's
Yeah.
quite a don't, you don't have to say you disagree with it, even you can be, or I mean, as in vehemently, you can say, I don't agree with that," but say, "Oh, that's really interesting, tell me what it is," and then kinda try and steer them to look at alternatives and to look at the other side of things, because there's loads of stuff out there that's probably in direct contrast to it. I think, as
So
I
you
say.
need to be ready for that conversation. Don't just jump into it because your instinct might be, this is all wrong. You should have nothing to do with it. But plan it in a way that you can do as you've said. Well,
Mhm.
what is it that attracts you to that? Let's talk
Yeah.
about that in
Yeah,
a measured
exactly.
way.
Let's be curious, because there'll be
Yeah.
something that's appealing. There'll be something in there that's appealing.
Yeah.
Just find out what it is and see if that can be achieved in another healthier way. And also, it's great for them to see the bigger picture. The boys and Many Good Men hadn't really perceived any of the negative stuff to do with Andrew Tate. They thought he was like an inspirational speaker. They really hadn't
Yeah.
seen the other side of it. And they didn't delve as much into the sort of gritty stuff as the girls did, because it was so out of their realm, really. But by the end of the project, they felt exactly the same way about the manosphere and about the stuff that was available and how risky it could be than the girls did. They just hadn't personally experienced it in the same kind of way. So they're a great example. They just took their time. They just took things slowly with them and allowed them to find information out for themselves.
So that gives us hope. There
Yeah,
are
oh,
ways
sure.
uh,
Yeah,
of
there's always
moving that. Yeah.
yeah,
And
yeah.
are there kind of myths about masculinity, about boys and relationships that you see starting very early in life that maybe encourage some of this if it's not challenged?
Yeah, it's an interesting one, isn't it? Because you still very much get, or what we still very much have a world where boys aren't encouraged to show their emotions in the same way as girls are. And I think that's at the root of this. If you look at the kind of not just the stereotypes, but the research tells us about the young men who get really involved in this, they're often very lonely and they're often not they're maybe not the big masculine guys, they're maybe the ones who feel like they should be, and they're not, they don't feel that they're achieving that. So I think allowing boys to talk about their emotions and to be emotional and to feel and not feel that that's not a masculine thing to do. I think that is absolutely key. I mean, we still very much not everywhere, but there's still a prevalence of boys don't cry, boys don't show emotions. And I mean, I don't know if you've got boys. I don't, but I've worked with lots of boys and have friends, but they're hugely emotional creatures. They're just, and they're dead sensitive. And to not allow that and to say that that's not manly, I think that can be really difficult for them. And I suppose as far as the political side of things, that they start to feel that women dominate, women are in charge of everything. I think if people learned the history of suffrage and about feminism and women's rights, and got a realistic picture of the world we're living in and how much things have changed in a very short space of time for women, that might help as well, so it can show what has really happened in regards to women's rights as opposed to the myths about women are taking everything away from men. And
Yeah,
allowing boys to do things that are perceived to be feminine and not gender and sport and, jobs and, because things are different now. And I think recently, because of marketing, toys are very much geared to boys, girls and boys. They weren't like that 20 years ago,
yeah,
you know. But they make more money by having separate things for girls and boys, I that's part of it. So again, being aware of that and just allowing boys and girls to play with whatever they want to play with and not shame it, not making them think it's wrong to want to do something that might be perceived to be soft.
yeah.
I think that's part of it as well.
Well, you've answered these questions extremely well, so well done. Um, our time's coming to a close now, but just one last thing. Where do you see the most hope or from young people themselves that they are fighting against some of these wrong attitudes or what we feel are wrong attitudes?
I think there's a lot of hope. I think there's a lot of young people who are choosing not to engage in this. They're either not on social media very much or they're very careful about, protecting themselves and others. I think we've got a lot more, certainly compared to 10 years, well, even 5 years ago, a lot more young women and girls who are like, I'm just not going to engage in any of this. I'm not,
Yeah,
going kind of back to the opposite of the sort of Instagram look, thinking I'm just going to be
yeah,
myself. And with boys as well. I mean, and I think so. I think interestingly, social media can be really good. So things like TikTok and Instagram, you find these young people who are brilliant, who are kind of fighting against it. There's been a real rise in feminist groups. There's lots of men doing lots of really good work with boys as well, and young men to try and allow them to just to be men and boys in whatever way they want.
yeah,
So so I think there is a bit of a I think there is a bit of a shift. I definitely do think there's a bit of a shift. I was given lots of hope working on the Many Good Men project, with that they really were kinda very much thinking for themselves and not wanting to be conned, I suppose, or, kinda taken into this world where people are gonna make money for them or exploit them. I think that's a really good in with young people is
yeah,
you see a big corporation or this person's
yeah,
making lots of money out you, then that's often a good a good way to get
yeah,
them to think about it, 'cause of, just the political kind of mindset. But no, there is hope. I think
yeah,
there absolutely it can't continue. I mean, I don't think it can continue the way it is. We've managed to change things before with attitudes, you know, and I'm pretty sure we can do it again. I think we're getting to that point now. People are talking about this now. 10
yeah,
years ago, nobody wanted to talk about it and nobody wanted to listen, and now they do. So, I think that's a massive change.
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, we're coming to the end of our time. Say if is there anything that you really wanted to say that you didn't get the chance to?
Oh goodness, no, I think you covered it there. Just that there's
Okay,
always hope.
good. I
Don't
know,
don't be
I
afraid to
know.
talk. Don't be afraid to talk. I think that's
Yeah.
the key thing. Yeah.
Yeah, and thank you so much. I think it's been enormously helpful, all the things you've said. I found it very useful. I hope people who are listening to this have, and you've been so good at explaining things in a very straightforward and real way. So thank you, and we're very grateful for your time. And um, we'll finish there, and hopefully people have found this helpful.
Thanks,
So
Linda.
thank you.